Hi, I'm David Miller, and this is the 8th of 9 mini-lectures on Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. Today we'll be looking at the first two movements of Volume 3. Last time, we saw how the conclusion of Volume 2 prepares for the first movement of Volume 3. Here's how Elizabeth's feelings and perceptions develop when she visits Darcy's estate at Pemberley. The changes in Elizabeth's feeling toward Darcy are conveyed indirectly through the narrator's description of her perceptions. Her visit is another scene of reading, one that starts with her first view of the grounds, then progresses into the house to an interview with the housekeeper, and concludes with her contemplation of Darcy's portrait in the upstairs gallery. This progress takes a striking turn when Darcy appears in person, as if the portrait has come to life. In the exchange of visits that follows, it becomes apparent that he has undergone his own change of heart since they last met at the parsonage in Hunsford. Just as it looks like Darcy and Elizabeth may reach an understanding, the news arrives that Lydia has eloped with Mr. Wicked. Elizabeth, mortified by the social disgrace of her worst nightmare come true, is convinced that now Darcy can never think of proposing to her. Once he appears unattainable, she is, of course, convinced once and for all of how much she loves him. Remember what I said earlier about perception and truth. Locke's principle that our judgments appear to us as perceptions governs Elizabeth's view of Pemberley. Beholding the estate for the first time, she sees the house standing well on rising ground, fronted by a stream of some natural importance that was swelled into a greater, but without any artificial appearance. The language describing her impressions of the landscape could apply almost verbatim to the judgments she's been unconsciously forming about Darcy himself. These judgments are coming out in the way she sees his property. This means that Elizabeth's tour of the estate will also serve as a revelation of the owner's character. In this way, the episode not only redeems Darcy, it also redeems property. All the vulgar talk we hear in this novel about so many thousand a year treats property in a purely mercenary spirit. Here, by contrast, we behold property as the outward expression of its owner's moral qualities. Property turns out to have its own eloquence, its own expressive style. As a result, Elizabeth reads the estate no less than she did the letter. The process of reading the estate is described just as carefully as that of reading the letter was in Volume 2, and it completes the reversal of Elizabeth's perspective on Darcy. We move from the grounds to the main rooms of the house and then to the upstairs, guided by the housekeeper, whose testimony adds to that of the property itself. She leads us from the miniatures on the first floor to the full-length portrait of Darcy upstairs, and so to the moment when Elizabeth's contemplation of his likeness crystallizes the transformation in her judgment of his character. At this moment, Elizabeth is once again perceiving Darcy as a surrogate father, a figure of protection and authority. As a brother, a landlord, a master, she considered how many people's happiness were in his guardianship, how much of pleasure or pain it was in his power to bestow, how much of good or evil must be done by him. Elizabeth has now completed her rereading of Darcy. Remember the passage I quoted earlier describing his appearance at the Meryton ball. That's when it takes Darcy about half the evening to go from being much handsomer than Mr. Bingley to having a most forbidding, disagreeable countenance. That transformation, presented so satirically by the narrator at the beginning of Volume 1, is now finally reversed, and the original perception of Darcy's dignity and good looks is restored. Only now the perception rests on a firmer foundation than rumors of his income. As thoughts of Darcy's power and authority pass through Elizabeth's mind, and before her eyes, the narrator tells us she stood before the canvas on which he was represented and fixed his eyes upon herself. Her fantasy is animating the portrait so vividly that it seems to look back at her. A few sentences later, Darcy appears before her, almost as if he had stepped out of the frame in the portrait upstairs in response to her admiring gaze. In fantasy, she had been revising her former impression of him, remembering the warmth of his regard while softening its impropriety of expression. Now he appears before her in person to confirm the change, treating her and her inferior connections with surprising courtesy and humility. Just when a happy ending is in sight, Lydia elopes with Wickham to raise the bar. The bar is what separates lovers, like the harsh law of patriarchal Athens in A Midsummer Night's Dream, or the feud between Montagues and Capulets in Romeo and Juliet. In traditional stories of grand, passionate love, Lancelot and Guinevere, Tristan and Isolde, Abelard and Eloise, and of course Shakespeare's young lovers, the bar is what makes the love hopeless, and therefore, of course, all the more romantic. It seems perverse that the same bar which makes love hopeless in these stories also provokes and strengthens it, but nothing makes us want something more than knowing we can't have it, and so it's one of the familiar paradoxes of the romantic tradition that in order to sustain the high pitch of transcendent passion, romantic love has to remain unfulfilled. Hence, the bar is not just an obstacle to such love, it is also a prop, the thing that holds it up. In this story, the bar is shame. It was the inappropriate behavior of Lydia and the rest of the Bennet family that drove Darcy and Bingley away at the end of Volume 1. Now that shame explodes in the scandal of Lydia's elopement. Just when Darcy, newly courteous, seems to have cleared the bar, Lydia raises it. And predictably, Elizabeth finds that she had never so honestly felt that she could have loved him as now, when all love must be in vain. Romeo and Juliet often provokes the question how the lovers can fall for each other so quickly. They're a serious version of the young lovers in A Midsummer Night's Dream, falling in and out of love at the drop of a flower. Jane Austen would agree that this isn't the way it should be done. Her narrator defends Elizabeth's change of heart toward Darcy by measuring its slow progress and its basis in gratitude and admiration against the romantic convention of love at first sight, or as Austen dryly names it, regard described as arising on a first interview with its object. Elizabeth's bad experience with Wickham, says the narrator, might perhaps authorize her to seek the other less interesting mode of attachment. But we don't want it to be too much less interesting. We don't want love to fade back into nothing but gratitude and admiration. So we need the bar, which comes back into the story now to bring a touch of the old romantic intensity and perversity to the otherwise all too prudent affections of Miss Bennet and Mr. Darcy. From this perspective, we might say that Lydia comes through just in the nick of time. So the bar returns with a vengeance in the second movement of Volume 3. Once Lydia has married Wickham, Elizabeth considers it out of the question that Darcy would connect himself to the man he so justly scorned. Now she regrets her mischance, convinced that she could have loved Darcy, humiliated to think what a triumph it would be for him to know how she feels, certain that they would have been the perfect couple, if only. This is the value of Lydia's elopement for the main story of the novel. By raising the bar, it not only prevents too quick a happy ending, prolonging the suspense with a more serious obstacle than ever, it also brings into the story an element of passion and perversity that link it to the great romances of the past. This sense of passion lends weight to the change in Elizabeth's character. Seeing how wrong she has been puts her through a humiliation just as severe as the one her rejection caused for Darcy. But hers is more real, For although we hear about his sense of shame and his change of heart, this only happens after the fact. We don't actually follow the change from within his point of view. Instead, we stay close to Elizabeth's mind. It's by giving us such a careful account of her change of heart, I think, that Austen can afford to produce Darcy's like a rabbit out of a hat. Next time, we'll start with the transition to the third movement of Volume 3, where we find Elizabeth humbled even further by something she learns from Mrs. Gardiner.